The equal time rule basically says if you give airtime to a candidate, you have to give equal airtime to all the candidates in that race, or at least give them the opportunity for that airtime. However, the rule is basically defunct, which is hugely problematic because let's say we have two candidates. Candidate A goes on, say, Sean Hannity. 5 million people watch his show a day. People who talk with their friends about what they saw, who in turn talk with their friends. And then whatever Hannity is reporting on, just by virtue of his status and reach, regardless of the topic's actual merit, once it's filtered through his show and his audience, it becomes news, which means other news outlets are likely to talk about it and disseminate that information to their audience, while candidate B has to rely on their social media, indie news, and their followers who are especially politically engaged. And it goes without saying that the money you're likely to raise after appearing before 5 million people is very different from what you're likely to raise after an indie media appearance before 30,000 people. This is how the media unilaterally dictate who acceptable candidates are, and it's another way the media meddles in our elections. And so they took this principle into account when they were writing the Radio Act of 1927. That's where the equal time rule first appeared, and it was then included in the Communications Act of 1934. But what about debates? If a news outlet is broadcasting a debate, doesn't that mean they have to include all the third-party candidates in the debate also, or at least give them comparable airtime after it? It does, which is why in 1960, for the Kennedy-Nixon debate, they suspended the equal time rule. Because think, what if one of the third-party debaters had alternative viewpoints which really resonated with Americans, and then people chose to go and vote for that person? That would be terrible. And so rather than potentially corrupt voters with ideas that land outside the two-party duopoly, they opted to just not have debates. For 16 years, there were no debates. People wanted to have them. In 1968, for example, Kennedy advisor Ted Sorensen suggested that the equal time rule be suspended again so we could give lots of free airtime to the two candidates of the two major parties without requiring equal time for each of the dozen or so minor party candidates. This is obviously undemocratic, but that didn't happen anyway, and the next debates weren't until the rule was changed. So in 1959, they added 4 exemptions to the equal time rule. If the piece of programming in question is a bona fide newscast, bona fide news interview, bona fide news documentary, or a bona fide news event, then the equal time rule would not be triggered. And in 1975, debates came to be considered bona fide news events. Very convenient, which means they didn't have to include third-party candidates. Thus, there was a debate in 1976 and every presidential election following. But the thing about the exemptions, and maybe you already figured this out, they effectively negate the entire rule. Example, 2020, Kentucky. Mitch McConnell's throat sack is up for re-election. Obviously, Democrats want him out, that's a huge priority. Amy McGrath comes along. She ran for Congress in 2018 and came up short. 2020, challenging Mitch McConnell for his Senate seat. Summer of 2019, she went on more than a dozen shows.
Amy McGrath joins me now.
Amy McGrath joins me now.
Now you are running to unseat Mitch McConnell in a Senate race in Kentucky.
Thus, she was a serious challenger. She raised, in a year, more than $40 million. Now, what would have happened if she hadn't gotten any attention from mainstream media? Well, we have an idea.
Joining me now is Steve Cox. He's a Democrat running for the Senate in Kentucky. So
Steve Cox ended up dropping out and throwing his support behind Charles Booker, who was basically a non-entity. He had only raised $300,000 in the first 3 months of 2020. But in June, Booker started gaining some traction. Most days in May, his Twitter account grew by a few hundred followers. On June 8th, his Twitter account grew by 20,000 followers. June 8th was the day he appeared on Chris Hayes. He also ended up raising over $2 million in June. He was now a serious contender, and no small part of that is because high-profile media hits gifted him the platform and deemed him legitimate. But Amy McGrath already benefited from a year of most people thinking she was the only person in the race. Now, if you want to say, Okay, but he wasn't in the race yet when Amy McGrath went on all those shows. Fine.
You contribute to the overall meanness of political discourse in America.
Fair.
McGrath slam!
But progressive Ted Terry was in a Georgia Senate race before Jon Ossoff. Jon Ossoff subsequently made media appearances that Terry would never get to do.
Jon Ossoff. John, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you can confirm you are a candidate for United States Senate in Georgia.
Tomorrow morning, I'll be announcing my candidacy for the United States Senate in Georgia. I'm excited.
He ended up raising $4 million. Terry ended up dropping out. In August and September of 2019, MSNBC gave Elizabeth Warren only about 2/3 the coverage of Joe Biden, and Bernie got only half that coverage. Side note, only 13% of it was positive. And then there is, of course, the most famous recent example of unequal coverage. Trump in 2015-2016 got $2 billion in free media coverage, a lot of that from liberal-leaning outlets. Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, received about 5% of that coverage. This is not to say that media coverage is the primary decider in a candidate's success. Obviously it's not. There are other mutually supportive factors. I mean, Jon Ossoff, for example, probably would have outraised Ted Terry no matter what. But these media appearances helped bolster the notion that he was the singular acceptable candidate. But still, the equal time rule is a very important concept, assuming it's enforced and actually given teeth, because without it, as we've seen, some voices are ignored and others are elevated, and somehow this inequality always seems to favor the more conservative voice. The fact that Trump got more airtime than any other candidate is criminal, and if every minute of airtime he received was then owed to every other candidate, I think it's entirely possible that he wouldn't be president. And that is the equal time rule and why we need a real one. So if you found this helpful or entertaining, please like and subscribe. It helps other people find this, and I will see you in the next one.